Hi everyone. I'm here tonight to talk about making sure your user research has an impact. It's one of the criticisms I've often heard leveled at user research, namely that when we do research, it doesn't actually affect things, or how do I even use the results that I have? So essentially, I'm going to be talking about sort of a model, a technique, if you will, of how you can make sure that won't happen. Really thinking about how user research can impact businesses and actually shift the kind of things that you really want to shift when you're doing good user research. So one of the questions that I think we all ask ourselves is, does my research matter? We know listening to users is important. We know actually interacting with our users and our customers really makes a difference, but sometimes it's challenging to get the rest of a company or an organization on board. I typically work with startups myself, so they either don't have their own researchers, or I've come in and been like the first researcher in an organization, and things like impact are the top of the list for people who are trying out research for the first time. So, with my consulting clients, which is what I do right now, I consult primarily for startups. I really try to focus on impact and actually giving them value, because, of course, as much as I think empathy and making a difference in a user experience is important, at the end of the day, I want people to crave user research, and they're not going to do that unless they feel it has impact on their business. So, first step in doing this is really choosing which metrics you want to improve. And this is the kind of thing that should be a joint exercise with executives, with product managers, with designers, with really anyone who cares about the user or the customer. So customer success is often one that really cares about metrics. And one of the things I do want to emphasize is that even if I am saying metrics, I mean metrics, anything that's really a baseline for a user behavior or revenue or anything that you can track and try to change. It doesn't have to be quantitative. It doesn't have to be, money driven. It could in fact be things like happiness, time to completion, all sorts of stuff. But you want to work with your stakeholders to make sure that the metrics you're trying to shift are in fact ones that will have an impact on your company. And there are different organizations set goals at different levels. Some people are better at it than others, but these are just some examples at different levels. For example, company-wide, you might have a revenue goals because that's sort of the lowest level of granularity you're going to get. In which case, the kind of research questions that you're going to be wanting to create are ones that have revenue impact. Department goals. So reducing support requests. This is a very common one because people want to make sure that users are having a better experience. It also saves money. But this is the kind of thing that absolutely going out and doing user research and understanding why people are coming in and requesting support is a big deal. Then you can also get down to the feature level. So maybe people are frustrated with your checkout experience, or it's taking a lot of time. You get a lot of inbound information that people are frustrated. That's another sort of metric you could decide that you want to shift. And often I know designers are going to be working on these sort of feature level ones or product level ones, but you can really work at any level of a goal. In fact, often I'm working on the sort of top level company-wide goals. So here are some very concrete ways that you can sort of look at these business metrics and then think about how actual user research design changes can impact them. You can do things like increase satisfaction. You're going to get better referrals, more referrals. You might also want to decrease the number of errors. You can lower training and support costs. These are all kind of things that user research can directly shift, and I have seen it done in my work. I've seen it done in many other user researchers' work. So really think about what measures could user research improve in your organization? What are the kind of things that you're struggling with right now, or your executives are kind of fretting about that you could propose? this is how user research and understanding our users could actually shift this. So I love this model. I stole this, so it's not it's not mine. But essentially, in my mind, research is essentially about shifting your users up this pyramid. So I like this because it shows essentially the levels at which users get certain emotions. And of course, as we know, a lot of our interactions with technology actually are emotion driven. They aren't, just these rational decisions made on, time to completion or anything like that. So essentially, you want to shift people up this because essentially, once you get up here, that's when technology is really going to get that stickiness. So essentially, this chasm that is highlighted here is the one that's really hard for most people, though I think many companies, many organizations don't go above here. But think about essentially tying this to the metrics I just discussed. What is causing your particular experience to be at a certain point on this pyramid, and how can you ask questions that will help you understand how to shift people up this particular pyramid closer towards pleasurable and meaningful. So second step, you want to build research questions that will actually help you improve these metrics. So it's not enough to just identify, we want to increase retention by X percent. You also want to then start working with your stakeholders to understand, okay, what are the things affecting my retention, my customer support requests. So I like using the sort of the newspaper model as I remember from elementary school. But the idea is that you're doing the who, what, when, where, why, and how to develop research questions. You might not obviously use all of these. In fact, most of the time you're not going to, but it helps you brainstorm different aspects of a user's experience and also their touch points with your particular technology product. So who, in this case, we're using the example of reducing support requests. So who is actually doing it? Who are your users? Are there specific segments or groups that you think are doing this? What are your hypotheses here? Are they same users, different users? The what is actually in the content of all the tickets, looking for patterns there. By understanding the content, maybe you can develop training around those specific features. When is there some sort of time-based component to this that might be really important? For example, if you are a streaming service and things are slow at certain periods of time, that's when you're getting the most requests, in which case the solution might end up being technical. But we don't need to go into all of these, but hopefully you get the idea that this helps you generate questions, and then you can prioritize. Which do we think are the ones that are likely to have the highest impact or that we know the least about? Essentially, you want to then use these questions to design a research plan, research goals. So picking the questions that are likely to, make the biggest impact on, whatever goal you have is really important. So that entirely depends on your organization and the kind of research you're doing, but you should hopefully be able to generate a very robust list of questions. And then, as my next slide shows, you also want to be documenting your assumptions. So in addition to these research questions, you want to be very clear about the assumptions you have related to the questions or assumptions you have related to the particular topic you're investigating. For example, who is currently submitting support requests? That's a very open-ended question. You could be segmenting things in a certain way, but people on your team almost certainly have some hypotheses around who is submitting the request. Maybe they've seen a bunch from a certain company. But in this case, the majority of losers lack programming and technical training. Thus, they're the ones who are submitting the support tickets. So that's saying something about your user population. That would be an assumption that you want to document so that you can then investigate and ideally test in some way, shape, or form. So here are some just good examples of what assumptions look like. I would say this is actually one of the biggest challenges I see for teams. And in fact, documenting assumptions is one of the first things I teach my mentees about. I do, career mentoring for more junior researchers, and really getting people to document their assumptions and what they believe is crucial, because there's a lot of unspoken knowledge and unspoken beliefs that can interfere with things, particularly when you're presenting results. If you haven't tested the assumptions, people are going to bring them up again, to be quite blunt. All right, so then you want to actually choose a method that fits your research question. So ideally, you've gone through, you've generated questions, you prioritize them. So now you want to actually choose a method that will help you answer these questions. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you have seen this model before. It's referenced often on the Nielsen-Norman group, one of my favorite resources for research. But the idea is that rather than letting the method drive what you're doing, you want to choose a method that appropriately helps you answer the questions you have. So there's the behavioral versus attitudinal axis, which is really about what people do versus what they say, what they believe, their feelings, versus what they're actually doing in the world. What buttons they're clicking, what things they're buying. Then on the qualitative versus quantitative axis, it's essentially how you're going about interrogating the problem. So qualitative research gives you all the whys, the hows, the becauses, for lack of a better term. Whereas quantitative research is much more about then taking these whys, these hows, and figuring out how prevalent it is, how big of a problem that it is, things like that. So in most of my work, I end up pretty much hanging out over in the qualitative side of things. Not to say I don't do quantitative work, but particularly when you're dealing with startups, you often are going to be doing, or even just newish products, you're often going to be dealing with this like why stuff. Usually that's the stuff that they don't know a lot about. One thing I really want to point out, because it's crucial, is there's a huge difference between what users do and what they say they do. So if you do interviews, which I do a lot of interviews, you can ask people what they do. When do you open this app? But the key is to not take that as gospel. What you are asking them is actually, what is your belief about what you do? Which is an important distinction, because it's about their self-perception, it's about what they remember, it's the most salient things, but do not expect it to map one for one to their actual behavior in your app, clicking buttons. You cannot conclude from just talking to someone what they're actually doing. You need to observe it. So observing could be anything from ethnographic field methods to looking at behavioral analytics. But you really want to be careful about saying that all because someone told you something, that's what they do. There's that very common survey question of how many times per week do you do this? That question is dangerous because of what I just outlined. That's much more about how often people think that they, log on to social media. It's not about how they actually do it. You can't say that you know what they're doing until you actually have some sort of observable data. So this is the other part of the Nielsen-Norman Christian Rohr model, but essentially this maps some of the most common user research methods. And what you want to do is really think about your research questions and how they map here. Figure out which quadrant they fit in, and then choose the method appropriately. Like I said, the vast majority of the kind of work I do, we end up doing things like interviews and ethnographic studies with some survey supplementation to actually figure out how prevalent things are. That's really sort of the loop that I am personally typically inhabiting. So hopefully you've learned by this point that leading with the method is not going to work, but I want to point out why. A lot of times you'll have someone, a stakeholder, come to you and be like, we want to do a survey. That's a very common one. People love surveys. That's a whole separate talk about why surveys are dangerous. But why do you want to do a survey versus something else? If it's, to essentially see the prevalence of a particular behavior or belief, then sure, then a survey might be correct. But until you can answer that why, it doesn't make sense. I want to do a survey to learn why our users churn. Is that really the best way to answer that particular question? Why a survey? In fact, learning why users churn on a survey is probably going to be not nearly as useful as actually talking to them and being able to ask follow-up questions and or watch them use your particular technology. So here is the version that I appreciate and think is the best. Essentially, we're struggling with retaining new users. I'd like to understand if they see value in our product and if this is affecting retention. This is a very good specific question because there's no method and there is a specific area that you can interrogate to figure out essentially what the relationship between value and retention is. So people, whoever is asking this question probably has an assumption about value, and maybe people aren't seeing the value. So that's why they have that question. So here's a quick example I'll go into from my own experience. This is directly pulled from working with a company, a sort of a late stage startup, and we were looking at user success. So essentially, this is a B2B company. They were struggling to get as much adoption as they'd like, so they would sell big contracts and then not see renewals. They would not see everyone using the number of seats they sold, so very low percentage of the seats used. So why was this happening? And especially they needed to answer these kind of questions because there was a company level goal to increase adoption by across all of the different platforms. So essentially they needed to understand how to increase adoption to achieve this goal. So the research, I'm not going to go through the whole process of developing a research question. It definitely took some iteration, brainstorming sort of along the process that I showed. But the research question we ended up coming up with was what causes people who use this product as part of their job, because we had to define users, to feel successful or unsuccessful. So one of the hypotheses was it's around how they feel, which is a great one. Oftentimes how someone feels is very, very much impacts their usage. And then if they are successful or unsuccessful, what enables or hinders them in achieving their goals? So ideally, by answering these questions, we're going to be shifting this adoption because we can then make changes in the product or processes or customer success, education, it's very open-ended, but we will be able to make changes that hopefully are reflected in increased adoption. So, unsurprisingly, with something this big and open-ended, we ended up having a lot of goals that we were hoping to achieve with the project. We had multiple assumptions we wanted to test. We had multiple questions that we wanted to answer. So, there was definitely an assumption that use case, essentially the type of problem that an organization was trying to solve with this technology, would affect their success. We needed to test that. Users who have technical skills are more likely to be successful on a particular ecosystem. There are more of these people. So essentially, you really want to be thorough about documenting your hypotheses and assumptions, and then going out and making sure that you're getting the kind of information you need. So I'm not going to go into the actual project, but the framing of the work and the questions you're coming up with are in fact the key to that impact. So in this case, ended up doing over 60 interviews and then a follow-up survey to do that, like how the prevalence thing, that's exactly the process that I outlined, which helped the company both develop baseline measures of success because they didn't have any, and then we can track essentially what interventions we make and how they're shifting success and adoption. So really, this is about how we move the needle for our users. So essentially, what can cause them to actually adopt this particular technology more widely, and ideally get the company that I was working with more revenue. So that is the connection here. When you're dealing with high risk research, so research that, for example, will require a significant investment or is very strategic, you ideally want to incorporate different methods, different types of data, because essentially your conclusions become more robust when you have different types of input from different places. It's called triangulation. I'll talk about it in a second, but you really get more out of your data if you're able to connect it to other related data. It makes your conclusions much more sound. So the last step is what I already alluded to, namely that once you've identified the things affecting your users and based on your research questions, you will make some sort of intervention and then you want to remeasure. I love this model from TripAdvisor that shows this loop, but the idea is that you understand the why, you understand the how. For example, maybe you identify that your checkout process has too many steps. I mean, that's a very common one. So once you do that, you can go and maybe reduce the number of steps, make it easier, and you start measuring. You say, all right, are people getting through it faster? Are more people getting through it? And then you can go back and try to essentially troubleshoot more after you've implemented your solution. Maybe you didn't get to your goal. So then you go and you're like, all right, so we reduced the time and number of pages people need to check out, but the numbers aren't still where we wanted. Then maybe you identify another big problem, which is maybe the products you're selling aren't the right ones. But then you hopefully see this like beautiful loop where you essentially are understanding the why, you're going off and measuring it once you've fixed it, and then you can, just iterate and improve everything over time. It's fabulous. So triangulation is really about linking different types of data, which includes qualitative and quantitative, but some other examples where, you get to these more robust conclusions, where you get this beautiful cycle is really just different types of data that have different goals. For example, I commonly, if possible, will link survey data to interview data. If someone both answers a survey and I've interviewed them, then I might have some self-reported beliefs that I didn't talk about in my survey, maybe some demographics, allows you to better segment your users. You can also link usage data and survey data, which is really powerful if you can do that, if you have that identifying information, because then you actually see what people are doing and how that's tied to what they believe. So once again, think of the sources of your data you have about your users and how you can combine them to actually come to stronger, robust conclusions. All right, recap, then I'll wrap up. So really choose which metrics you want to improve. This is a collaborative process with the rest of your stakeholders, but what things are really important to your company, your organization, your business, and how can you affect them? So then once you've identified that, go off and build research questions that will actually shift these if you can identify, causes and problems. Then you want to actually choose a method that will appropriately help you answer the questions you've generated that will impact the business. And then you go out and you learn and make changes and you remeasure and you essentially do this beautiful loop where you're coming up with lots of important information for your organization that really will shift things for everyone. It's not just for you as a user researcher, it's for everyone. You're helping achieve greater goals. And I'm going to wrap up. I believe we'll have time for questions. I can be reached on LinkedIn. My email is my first name dot my last name at gmail.com. Happy to talk to anyone about user research and their career. I do offer mentoring, so I also just love talking shop and talking about user research. So I will wrap up. Thanks so much.